Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed.
Hello again, and welcome to On the Ballot, Ballotpedia's podcast, where we talk about all things politics, policy, and today we're going to talk about courts, the U.S. Supreme Court in particular. And joining me is, I think, somebody who's probably overqualified to talk about this.
I don't know about that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Zachary Shemtob, the executive editor, I should say, of the SCOTUSblog, Georgetown Law School product. You have both practiced and taught law, criminal, white collar, that kind of stuff, and written extensively on the courts. But I know there's a lot to talk about, so let's just dive right into this. A lot of material came before the justices in this term, particularly in this last batch of cases they ruled on. 10 years from now, Zach, what will we still be talking about? What will they still be teaching in law schools from this term?
So this isn't going to be a super exciting answer because it's the obvious one.
Okay.
But I think the three big cases this term, which were CASA, Trump v. CASA, which was the case which dealt with universal injunctions or nationwide injunctions in terms of birthright citizenship. And where in that case, the court, in an opinion written by Justice Coney Barrett, found that universal injunctions were essentially a no-go. So a universal injunction, for those who don't know it, is when a lower court, a district court, enjoins an executive action or even, an action from the government from taking place across the entire country. So, for instance, a district court in Massachusetts could enjoin a policy, and even though it's just a court in Massachusetts, that has an effect on the entire United States and shuts it down. And in that case, which dealt with the birthright citizenship order, the court essentially said that universal injunctions are no good. Now, they left some loopholes, which we can discuss a little later, but I think that was a very important decision to start off with, or to end the term with.
And you said there were three. What's number two?
The other ones I would say were United States versus Skrmetti. This was the trans case, the idea that, whether a Tennessee law passed banning certain therapies for trans minors, and the Supreme Court found that the Tennessee legislature did indeed have the power to do that. It was not a violation of equal protection. So they allowed that to go into effect, and there are many other states which have similar laws, so those laws can now stay in place. I think that's going to be an important case for a number of reasons. One, because of the hot button cultural issues. Right. Two, I think the question it has on adults, trans adults. And three, what's going into whether, trans folks are a suspect class and therefore entitled to what's called heightened scrutiny. So is there kind of extra scrutiny or extra emphasis on that class that needs to be put into place when policies are taken against them? Then I'd say, besides Skrmetti and CASA is probably Mahmoud v. Taylor. And this was the case where parents wanted to opt out their children, religious parents from a number of different religions, to opt out their children from LGBTQ-themed books. One was about a wedding. The other one was called Pride Puppy. And these parents basically said, it was violate our religion, our free exercise, to have our children exposed to this. We should be able to determine their education. And the court, in a familiar pattern of 6-3, with the conservatives leading, an opinion written by Justice Alito, decided that the parents could do that, and that was a violation of, their religious freedoms to force the students to be there for those LGBTQ books and lessons. So I think that case will also have ramifications in terms of the freedom of religion, again, LGBTQ issues, and how far that extends.
Now, you mentioned that one was a 6-3 decision. People are generally surprised because we've been conditioned otherwise to think that the court works in blocks, and those blocks are somehow at loggerheads most of the times. But the justices tend to vote together quite a lot. How did that break down this term?
Yeah, so it's a great question. This term, 42% of the cases were unanimous. So not
Okay.
quite half of them, but a healthy percentage. This was actually fewer than years past. Last year it was 44%, and the year before that it was actually 50%.
Okay.
Uh, the year before that, interestingly enough, it was actually 29%.
Oh.
So they've certainly improved on that number. So a healthy amount of the cases are unanimous, where you don't see these blocks. And I should also add, the block everyone thinks of is the 6-3 conservative liberal block.
Right.
That's not always the way it breaks down. When you look at some of these blocks, they can also be 5-4, and they can be 6-3 with different combinations of justices. For instance, and we can talk about this further as well, Gorsuch on occasion joins, the so-called liberals. Kavanaugh does as well. And then, of course, we have all this controversy now about Barrett joining the liberals in certain cases. So they're not always the traditional 6-3 split that one would expect.
And is there anybody who aspires to that, what is it, Justice Kennedy role of being the ultimate decider
I
on
mean, the ultimate
those
decider
cases?
this term was Roberts.
Oh, really? Okay.
He was in the majority in 95% of cases.
Okay.
He didn't actually write himself any concurrences or dissents. And that just shows how confident you are. When you don't write any concurrences or dissents, you're basically saying, I'm confident enough to have my opinions out there and vote along when I need to vote along, and that's it. So he actually dominated this term. After him was Kavanaugh. I believe Kavanaugh was 92%.
Yeah.
In terms past, Kavanaugh has actually been the most powerful justice. And after Kavanaugh was Barrett at 89%. So I wouldn't say there's a swing justice in the way you had a Kennedy or an O'Connor.
Mhm.
With Kennedy and O'Connor, um, you didn't quite necessarily know which way they were going to go. Sometimes they went liberal, sometimes they went conservative. The Chief Justice tends to go conservative, or at least moderate conservative. So there's no true swing justice, but he certainly had control of the court this time around. It was the Roberts court.
And who's that justice who is on the wrong side of, say, 7-2 or 8-1 decisions? Who's the one that's really out there as a lone wolf, so to speak?
So I wouldn't say there's any real lone wolves anymore.
Okay.
Interestingly, I think Thomas wrote the most dissents this time around. And I know Jackson did as well. Yeah, Thomas wrote 9 dissents this term in terms of, we're talking about opinions of the court. Actually, Jackson wrote the most dissents,
Okay.
followed by Thomas. Thomas wrote the most overall opinions. So I'd say, though, in that position of, crying out against the majority the most are Sotomayor and Jackson. And they usually vote together, though, so it's not just, one justice doing it. And then you occasionally have these dissents from Gorsuch, which can kind of seem to come out of nowhere, but he's kind of like laying down his claim.
Crying out against the majority. That's
Yeah.
I've never heard it called that, but I
I
like it.
we saw quite a bit of that with Jackson this time around. If you read some of her dissents, they are blistering.
Well, and there was a little kerfuffle in the, was it the CASA decision
Yes.
between Barrett
Yep.
and Jackson? I mean, there were some rather pointed and personal words in those opinions. Is how often do we see that?
Not often, especially from Barrett. I was at a committee or a convention at one point, and Barrett was describing her style, and she said, I'm a one jalapeno pepper girl, or one jalapeno pepper woman. I don't write, unlike, Justice Scalia, who was a 5 jalapeno pepper guy. I don't write these blistering opinions or dissents. So to see this coming from Barrett was very rare. And just specifically to talk about that, Jackson had written a dissent in CASA where she kind of decried the majority's position and said it was, untethered in law and, does a disservice to the law. And Barrett's response was that Jackson, was welcoming an imperial judiciary. And to come from Barrett, that's really saying something, because she is generally a very kind of calm writer. You see much more rhetoric from the pen of, I'd say, Gorsuch or Thomas.
And usually we're talking about imperial presidencies, not imperial judiciaries.
Yes.
So that was an interesting thing. Now let's go into the weeds for just a bit here, and let's talk about, let's say, that the topic of parental rights, because you had mentioned the Mahmoud decision, but there was another one. There was what was it, Medina versus Planned Parenthood
Ye-
too.
Yeah.
How do those two, state authority, parental rights, government funding, what's the nexus in those two cases?
Well, Medina wasn't as much on parental rights. In Medina, the governor of South Carolina had banned Planned Parenthood based on its abortion services from the state's Medicaid program. And the Supreme Court ruled that a South Carolina woman in Planned Parenthood didn't have a legal right, known as standing, to bring a lawsuit under Section 1983. Section 1983, you bring against state officers who have violated federal law. And so as a result of that, this woman in Planned Parenthood couldn't bring their claim forward and therefore get Medicaid funding that they claim they were entitled to. So the Supreme Court didn't actually decide it on substantive grounds. It decided it on more procedural grounds, what they were and they were not entitled to. One thing in common, though, is we again see a 6-3 split. And this was the 6-3 split with the conservatives on one side and the liberals on the other, just like was the case in Mahmoud, in a hot button cultural issue. Justice Gorsuch actually wrote Medina. Mahmoud was Alito. And Mahmoud was different in that it dealt much more with substance of the actual parental rights and what they were entitled to in terms of religious freedoms. And obviously you could argue both ways there. But yeah, they were both hot button cultural issues that dealt with the power of the state to regulate certain things or actions.
And then there was also, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a criminal due process case, where the Gutierrez case.
Yep.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that one?
So in Gutierrez is a little, it's a little complicated. I find the most complicated cases I generally find to be criminal procedural law and immigration law. But just to give you a little bit on Gutierrez, in that case, they ruled that a Texas man on death row could bring a federal civil rights claim to challenge the constitutionality of state laws governing DNA testing. And so basically, under Texas state law, you could not challenge or try to open your case for DNA review unless you could show you wouldn't have been convicted. So if you were going to end up on death row, that wasn't enough. You would have to show altogether that you weren't going to be convicted. And the court actually ruled here by a vote of 6-3, but not the traditional 6-3. The opinion was, written by Justice Sotomayor. And they said that this, and I'll read off a little. Sotomayor observed that to the extent Texas law precludes him, being Gutierrez, from obtaining the requested evidence, being, opening his DNA test, it violates his rights under the Due Process Clause. And so ultimately here, the court had a liberal outcome and allowed this. Now, it does not mean that Gutierrez goes free or goes off death row. It just means that it could potentially be opened in terms of this DNA analysis and recognize potential due process rights.
And criminal decisions that come to the Supreme Court, I agree. I've tried to read those as a layman, and I feel like I'm having to learn another language along the way. So thank you for that.
They're written in their own language.
They are, and sometimes you miss the nuance, and not to mention the jokes sometimes that appear in the
Right.
footnotes. But maybe that's a thing of the past too. But here's the question: let's look ahead a little bit, shall we?
Yeah.
Are there any cases that you can see that have been already accepted to be heard in the next term, or maybe pending, that might be worth watching?
So I think a big one, there's going to be more trans cases on several issues. But I think a big one that was just granted was National Republican Senatorial Committee versus Federal Election Commission. And this is a potentially major case on campaign finance regulations, in which whether parties can restrict spending money on campaign advertising with input from political candidates.
Okay.
It was actually found in, I believe, a 2001 case that this could be restricted, and this case is now going to be re-reviewed. And just the fact that the justices have granted cert here and are going to re-review that case indicates to me that it may very well likely be overturned. And I could see given its campaign finance spending, I could see another 6-3 conservative liberal decision. In terms of other things that we should be looking out for, the emergency docket is still
Yes.
out there.
Yes.
I don't know how much. I mean, it's a pretty educated audience, but I don't know how much folks know about the emergency docket. But it's basically when a lower court grants a stay of an here in these cases an executive action, and then the Biden administration did it, and now the Trump administration rushes to the Supreme Court and they say, you need to pause or lift this stay. And the court then has to decide very quickly whether to do that without briefing and without oral argument. And so you have all these emergency docket cases. A lot of them have to do with RIFs or reduction in force of government employees.
Right.
So on SCOTUSblog, one of the most common questions we get is, I am, a federal employee. What is going on with these RIFs? Am I going to have my job in a few weeks? And we have to say to them, it's pending in the emergency docket. We don't know. But these cases are likely to be decided in the next few weeks, and we're likely to have a lot more emergency docket cases to come. The final thing I'll say is, at some point, the merits of the birthright citizenship order are going to be decided. As I said, the nationwide injunction issue is now out there, has been decided, but the actual merits of the case, whether Trump's order was constitutional, whether you can, change
Mhm.
birthright citizenship, hasn't
Right.
been decided, and that will come up to the Supreme Court at some point.
Because those have been refiled as class actions. Is that what
Uh,
I'm understanding?
so the loopholes that came about, I don't want to get too technical, but I guess we're already stuck. We're already there.
Goodbye.
Um, are okay. So you can't bring nationwide injunctions. What can plaintiffs do? What can parties do? And one way is indeed class actions. So this is on behalf of a particular class, even though that represents a whole host of plaintiffs. Another one is whether states can bring claims on behalf of people in those states who move to other states. And the third thing actually is the emergency docket. So now district courts can't issue nationwide injunctions, but the Supreme Court can decide for the entire nation. So maybe we'll now see all these emergency docket cases coming to the Supreme Court where they're saying, oh, can you now decide on all of these issues that would have previously been nationwide injunctions by the district courts? And Justice Kavanaugh actually invited this in his concurrence in CASA, saying, hey, we have an emergency docket, essentially, we can decide these cases. So,
Interesting.
yep. So there are loopholes remain.
So, bottom line is that instead of having maybe a sleepy summer where we can go away and recharge for the everything to get started back in the fall, we could have an extraordinarily busy Supreme Court summer, possibly.
Yeah, it's a blessing and a curse for SCOTUSblog.
Well, the alternative is that we don't have anything to do and we're all waiting for football season to start again. Not that we aren't, but
Of course.
Zach, there's so much more to talk about, and I know that we'll have you back on to discuss this and more, particularly if that emergency docket gets heated up again. But Zach's Zach Shemtob, I almost sneezed on you there, with executive editor of SCOTUSblog. Thank you for joining us today on The Ballot. We appreciate it.
Yep. Happy to have been here. Yep.
And I'm Norm Leahy. I forgot to tell you that at the beginning in case you didn't know who's this guy anyway. And I'm a senior editor here at Ballotpedia. Thank you for joining us. And you can listen to this wherever you get your podcasts and see us on YouTube. Until then, we'll see you in the digital pages of Ballotpedia. Take care.